In the age when Persia devoured kingdoms as the Dark Sea devours broken hulls, there stood within Arabia's heart one man who had never learned the meaning of surrender. His name was Hani ibn Mas'ud al-Shaybani, lord of the Bakr ibn Wale, a man around whom history wove its heaviest glory, for his tale confounds the logic of empires and the cold calculus of political reason. His gravitas did not flow from the mass of his frame alone. It blazed from that luminance in his eyes that declared to every witness, a life stripped of honor is no life worth the drawing of breath. The banners of his tribe beat against the wind like the wings of a free eagle above a summit, and the warriors encircling him carried in their gaze the faith of men who knew that death was honor, never punishment. When the kings of Persia heard of his defiance, it surpassed mere political calculation. A quiet tremor coursed through the councils of their advisors, for this man embodied something that no census of iron could ever measure or contain. The man who transcends the arithmetic of gain and loss, who holds the keeping of a sacred oath above every army and before every empire. That is Hani ibn Mas'ud upon the true scales of history. In the encampments of Arabia scattered like stars across the infinite desert, odes of praise were sung for men of his likeness. For Arab verse recorded heroism long before parchment ever served that solemn and sacred purpose. Hani required no swarming legions to carve his presence upon the map of power. His word alone was worth 1,000 unsheathed blades, and his faithfulness to a pledge was worth 1,000 towers and iron bastions. Such is the hallmark of the true commander, to forge from unyielding will a fortress no mortar can build, and to make of his refusal to be broken a testament that outlives his age and speaks to every generation that follows. The vast wilderness spoke of him in voices swollen with pride, declaring, "This man carries within his chest the ancestral fire that has not been extinguished since the very first dawn of recorded time." When the Arab tribes questioned how they might stand against an empire as vast and merciless as Sassanid Persia, the answer always manifested in a single living image, the immovable endurance of Hani ibn Mas'ud. In that era which chronicles name the age of ignorance, the true measure of sovereign leadership lay not in gold or in slaves, but in steadfastness of stance when fear itself shook the mountains to their very roots. He who knows death and does not flinch, who meets the savage enemy with eyes that neither waver nor harbor the phantom of retreat, he alone deserves the title of commander by the ancient and unwritten law of the desert. Hani ibn Mas'ud was no mere figure catalogued in the genealogical scrolls. He was a living philosophy entire, the doctrine of refusal, of dignity, and of sovereign free choice unto the very last breath that a man may draw. His eternal image endures in Arab historical memory. A man standing with iron defiance before a torrent of steel, laughing into the face of the impossible, for dignity is mightier than any blade forged in any furnace on this earth. To comprehend the magnitude of what transpired, one must first grasp the depth of the abyss upon whose edge the Arabs stood, and the scale of the Iron Empire that came to teach them the lessons of dust and humiliation. Sassanid Persia in that epoch was no merely grand kingdom. It was a war machine of terrible clockwork precision, stretching from the depths of India to the borders of Rome in absolute and unquestioned dominion over the known world. The armies of the Persian Caesars advanced like a black tempest of iron and fire, war elephants shuddering the earth at their vanguard, and armored cavalry filling the horizon with the blinding gleam of plate beneath the merciless and indifferent sun. The armored Persian cavalry alone was sufficient to obliterate an entire tribe without hesitation, and their weaponry, advanced beyond all measure in that age, rendered confrontation from the very outset something closer to deliberate and total annihilation. Yet, on the opposing side stood Hani, guardian of the sacred trust of al-Nu'ayman ibn al-Mundhir, armor and women, entrusted to his honor, standing with the tribes of Bakr ibn Wa'il against this colossal and suffocating Persian knight. Can you envision the tableau? Arab tribes blazing like a solitary flame within an ocean of imperial darkness, hearts beating with iron resolve, whilst the Persian host, weapon to the teeth, encircled them from every horizon and every direction. Khosrow's emissary arrived at Hani's tent, announcing the terms of surrender in the tongue of the conqueror, his words wrapped in imperial arrogance and the absolute certainty that the reply would be swift, craven, and unquestioning capitulation. The conditions of the Persian Empire were clear and absolute. Surrender the trust, acknowledge subordination, prostrate before the will of the great king, and you shall be granted the peace of those who consent to live forever in another's shadow. Hani stood and heard the terms with a face like ancient granite through which no words could penetrate, then turned to the assembled lords of the tribes, and his eyes met theirs, and they answered him without a single syllable spoken aloud. Hani's reply to Khosrow's envoy fell like a thunderbolt upon a clear sky. We surrender our trust to no one, and we bow before nothing save our honor. Let Khosrow bring every last one of his armies. We shall meet them as we deserve. The envoy returned stupefied. He had not anticipated refusal from these Arabs in the face of uncountable thousands. And when he relayed the answer to his commanders, astonishment and rage intertwined upon Persian faces like smoke weaving through flame. The Persian commanders dispatched a second message, harsher and more severe, listing their legions and their vast arsenal, hinting at the fate that awaits those who dare refuse the will of the empire with such reckless and presumptuous madness. The Arab reply came more resolute and more eloquent. We have spoken what we have spoken, and we are not a people whom numbers may terrify, for death among us is lighter than dishonor and dearer than a life dragged in abasement and shame. The emissary returned for the final time, bearing softened and enticing terms, offering gold, security, and recognition of tribal lordship, but with one price appended to all of it: the betrayal and surrender of what was most sacred and sworn. As though the Persian Empire had grasped that it stood before something different, something that the bare language of force could not subdue, it attempted to purchase these men with the same coin that had bought kingdoms and dynasties before them. But Hani refused, and the tribes refused alongside him, not from recklessness, not from ignorance of the battle's dimension, but from a conscious and sovereign choice, whose price all who made it fully understood: death or dignity, with no third path between. In that moment, when the gates of negotiation were sealed and the war banner was raised, Hani transformed from tribal chieftain into something far deeper, a symbol destined to transcend his age, his land, and unite the Arabs into one wall of iron. The sky above the desert of Dhi Qar that night was jeweled with stars and crystal clear, as if the cosmos itself opened wide its eyes to witness what men who chose honor in the silence of the great were fashioning for the ages of eternity. Words between them that night were few, for men of true stature do not squander their final hours in idle speech, but rather counsel their sons, make ready their souls, and dress themselves in the dark and heavy armor of sovereign fate. When dawn broke over the waters of Dhi Qar, it did not rise as an ordinary dawn. It appeared as a witness to a moment that would be carved into Arab memory forever. A nation confronting its destiny with bare and unbowed chests turned toward the iron. The Arabs were no strangers to the science of war. They understood it far beyond the counting of men and weapons, reading earth and wind and soul as instruments of battle, no less lethal than the sword or the lance. The first blow in any battle strikes not at flesh but at the soul. For the true contest is won first in the imagination of soldiers. And the lords of Bakr knew this secret that so many of their enemies had failed to grasp. And so they chose terrain that granted them the advantages of the land, positioning at the waters of Dhi Qar between the flatland and the tree line to nullify the Persian advantage in numbers and to hamper their elephants and heavy cavalry entirely. The genius of desert tactical formation is the oldest secret of military art. When you compel a vast army to fight upon your chosen ground, you abolish the power of their numbers and transform the battle into your own preferred arena of absolute destruction. Hani and the tribal lords arrayed their warriors with the precision of men who knew every fallen man would leave a void, planting ambushes in the valley, drawn tight at the blow, coiled to strike precisely when the moment of opening came. In a single decisive act, the warriors severed the leg ropes of their own horses and placed the litters of their women in plain sight. One stark and irrevocable message: there is no retreat this day, for a life rescued by cowardice is no life. The winds bore the dust of the advancing Persian host, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of elephants and iron hooves, and the sky itself was swallowed by choking clouds of dust. A premature and suffocating darkness descended across the plain. The Persian tide broke upon the Arab positions like a massive swell attempting to extinguish a solitary flame, but some flames refused to be snuffed by the wind and instead blaze fiercer and more terrible against the very gale that assails them. The vanguard line held like a wall of living granite before the surge of the ocean, Persian blows shattering against that human rampart which refused to tremble or surrender even a single hand's breadth of the blood-consecrated ground beneath its feet. The first Persian assault was launched with crushing force, designed to end the battle in minutes, but the riders of Bakr absorbed it with their bodies and repelled it with their souls, and the great assault halted in a wide-eyed stupor of disbelief. At the burning heart of the combat storm, the Arab commanders fought like lions that had been wounded yet never broken, roaring to their men across the carnage, reforming shattered ranks at every breach opened by the enemy's relentless and desperate blows. This was no ordinary battle. It was the highest form of sacrifice the ancient Arab world had ever witnessed, every man fighting as though he alone were the entire army, in a single impossible and glorious and blood-drenched instant of history. The fallen heroes dropped one by one, not fleeing, not surrendering, but fighting still, each man carrying his final wound as an iron decoration of honor, leaving behind whatever regret remained beyond the threshold of the life he had crossed without a tremor. The Persian war elephants sent terror reverberating through every heart, but those who remained fought with the madness of men who had nothing left to lose, driving arrows into the great beast's eyes until they turned and trampled the Persian ranks in blind catastrophe. The commanders in the vanguard, bodies laden with wounds, blood staining the pale sand crimson, their voices still thundered across the field with the cry of steadfastness, igniting the ancestral embers that burn eternally in the chest of every man who refuses to kneel. When a soldier watches his commanders hold firm with bodies riddled with wounds, the fear evaporates from his chest, and in its place enters something darker and greater: pride, defiance, and the absolute refusal to be found weaker than the man beside him in the dust. The numbers contracted little by little, but the fury did not contract. It intensified and escalated, as if every man who fell bequeathed his entire strength and the full weight of his wrath to those who remained standing in the unyielding and unrelinquishing line. The Persian cavalry began to question in the silence of their own hearts: What is it these Arabs fight for? No kingdom stands behind them, no treasure, only something called honor, an invisible force the eye cannot see, yet one no sword has ever defeated. That question was the most lethal weapon on the entire field, to plant within the hearts of their enemies an existential bewilderment, to make them doubt the worth of a campaign against men who refuse to acknowledge the very concept of defeat. Victory over the body is easily achieved, but victory over a will that refuses to surrender confounds the conqueror himself and forces him to ask in the deepest corridors of his doubt, can we truly break these warriors, or have we already lost the war? The battle shifts in its most decisive moments from the field of swords to the field of the soul, and it was precisely here, in this invisible arena, that the Arabs had already secured their truest and most enduring victory before the combat dust had settled. Every blow struck by the sons of the desert carried within it a declaration. We do not fight to live as thralls. We fight to prove there exists something more precious than life and more enduring than all the empires that have risen from the dust. Persian armor blazed beneath the scorching sun, overlapping lances forming forests of iron across the horizon, and the assaults came on like ocean waves that know no pause, waves that acknowledge neither mercy nor the broken pleading of those already fallen. Yet the warriors on that blood-soaked plain endured by the logic of lions, not arithmetic, for a single lion in his own domain is worth 1,000 foreign wolves who do not know the nature of the ground on which they stand and bleed. Hours of ferocious and unrelenting slaughter, blood spilled, war cries dissolving into one another, and the Persian ranks eroding piece by piece as though fire devoured timber that had been consecrated to the flame from the very first moment of its existence. Still the warriors of Bakr ibn Wa'il remained standing, their bodies transformed into chronicles of every blow received, yet their souls refused to sheathe their blades and refused the shame of forced retreat from the sacred and blood-soaked ground beneath them. When the Arab ambush erupted from the valley under the command of their horsemen, encircling the heart of the Persian army from every direction, terror supplanted arrogance in the enemy's ranks with the sudden and total finality of a slamming iron gate. Even in the most savage and merciless of moments, the Arabs did not bow their heads before the greatness of the war elephant. They raised their blades heavy with the blood of honor and fell upon the Persian commanders with wills of absolute and unyielding steel. They fought until they had exhausted every last reserve of strength in every muscle and sinew, until the ranks of Khosrow's great host shattered, not merely broken in defeat, but obliterated like a blade struck too many times beneath the blacksmith's hammering. That is the eternal difference between a man who fights because he is paid and a man who fights for his honor, between him who is caged by a king's command and him who is driven by his own dignity. And that difference alone made history. The Persian army could not endure against the Arab torrent, for free men who refuse to acknowledge defeat steal from the arrogant conqueror his very spirit, leaving him hollow and shivering on the field he had already counted as his own to keep. The military victory was Arab in every measure, but the spiritual and historical triumph was greater still, for the story of Dhi Qar will be spoken across the ages whilst the very names of the Persian commanders dissolve into forgotten and unremarkable dust. The Day of Dhi Qar. That is the name the Arabs bestowed upon this battle, for in it they struck a covenant with time itself, that this singular blood-forged moment should remain alive in the memory of the nation unto the furthest reach of eternity. And it proved the most precious and most enduring covenant ever struck, for the empire that believed it would obliterate the Arabs had unknowingly planted with its own iron hand a legend of unity that would never perish in any age or era. Armies are broken and empires fall, but those moments when warring tribes unite to choose honor above life are carved into the bedrock of human memory, immovable and imperishable, beyond the reach of all decay, to the very end of all things. The battle ended with the rout of Persia, but something unseen began to course through the veins of the Arab tribes, that same spirit which had fought and triumphed and had never once, in its darkest and most desperate hour, bent its knee to any power. The storytellers carried the tale of Dhi Qar from encampment to encampment, from tent to tent, from generation to generation. Like a living ember passed from hand to hand through the darkness, lest the flame perish before its work in the world was complete. The story of the day of Dhi Qar became a true foundational legend in the conscience of the pre-Islamic Arabs, a seed that would bloom in countless decisive stands upon the vast and blood-consecrated ground of the greater history of all nations. When Islam came and forged the Arab warrior into a nation, it found fertile soil long prepared for dignity, so much so that the Prophet himself spoke of that day. This is the first day upon which the Arabs took full measure from the Persians. The Arab warrior at Al-Qadisiyah and in the great battles of conquest carried in his soldier's soul something of the spirit of Dhi Qar, the contempt for superior numbers, and the absolute faith in the supremacy of the unconquered gold. When Tariq ibn Ziyad burned his ships, he invented nothing new. He was reforging the ancient equation of severing the horse ropes, cut off the road of retreat, and men who were soldiers transform into something far more terrible, into lions with nowhere left to run. The principle of unity against empires would repeat itself in different forms across the long centuries. In every great battle waged by Islam with few against many, this same dark and unconquerable alchemy surfaced again from the depths of the Arab martial tradition. When Khalid ibn al-Walid pierced through the jaws of destruction with his vanguard, he was mastering what the lords of Bakr had mastered long before him, that the warrior soul of an army is built upon the stories of those who refused surrender before it. The day of Dhi Qar is not merely a footnote in the genealogical scrolls, it is a complete lecture in the science of the warrior's soul. For the morale of soldiers is determined entirely by the burning stories they carry deep within their chests. An army that knows its ancestors fought and prevailed against an empire enters the field already bearing the immense weight and glory of that memory upon its shoulders. And that weight does not burden the man. It transforms him into a mountain of iron. The lessons of desert tactical positioning employed at Dhi Qar would be applied again in the decisive turning point battles of Islamic military history, where commanders transformed the very terrain of their landscape into a fortified bastion of iron and sovereign will. Modern military history teaches that the spirit of warriors may surpass the advantage of arms and numbers, and what the Arabs accomplished on that day was a living and practical enactment of this truth, centuries before it was inscribed in any doctrine or codex. In the studies of military academies on superiority of will and doctrinal psychological warfare, one can trace roots extending far back into moments like the moment of Dhi Qar, in that vast, indifferent, and merciless desert of ancient time. What is the name of the Persian general who led the host against the Arabs? Few recall it now, but the name of Hani ibn Mas'ud is still spoken with fierce and undiminished pride across centuries too vast to be counted by any mortal hand. That is the equation of historical immortality. It is not numbers that immortalize a commander. It is the stance he takes, and not his treasures, but the refusal with which he faced the tyrannical empire that believed itself supreme over all the earth. Hani ibn Mas'ud was neither prophet nor king. He was an Arab man of flesh and blood who chose to honor a sacred trust and thereby became greater than life itself, granting that brief mortal life an immortal and indestructible meaning for all time. And this is the inheritance he bequeathed to all who came after him, that a man is not measured by the length of his years, but by the depth of his stance. Not by the multitude of his armies, but by the magnitude of his armies, but by the magnitude of the principle he defends. Whenever a small army faced a great one in the Arab Islamic tradition and chose to stand its ground rather than flee, there was always that silent voice borne on the desert wind, stirring those hearts with the ancient and imperishable spirit of Dhi Qar. The first narrators who preserved the story of Dhi Qar were no mere transmitters of news. They were performing the most sacred function in the history of all nations, keeping the ember of dignity alive through every darkness and through every annihilating age. And you, now, after countless centuries have fallen like dust since that day, you hear the tale of men who stood against the world to honor a trust and said no, for history is not written by those who bow, but by those whose stances outlive their mortal flesh.